Hello again and welcome back to my sewing room. Today we're going to make the pumpkins patched block, which is number 5 in the Sew Your Stash series. The size baskets that I'm working out of today are my 3.5-inch strips and my 7-inch strips, and also out of my 3.5-inch squares bin. Now, because they're pumpkins, I'm just using orange, and for the stems, I can use the browns that are in my 3.5-inch strip basket, and I also grabbed just the stack from my 2.5-inch strips baskets of the browns, because I'm going to cut some of the stems 2.5 inches and some of the stems 3.5 inches. And we're just going to be using a variety of the bee backgrounds, and here I have some cut for the top of the stems. So let me just show you with a close-up what the block looks like. So here's a short pumpkin, and this one I've just made out of one fabric. Here's another short pumpkin block, and it's made of 3.5-inch squares. So you can either make a plain pumpkin or a patched pumpkin, and you saw that in the opening. These are the short pumpkins. The tall pumpkins, plain, and here's 6 3.5-inch squares. Now what's fun about this block is the pumpkins themselves. Here, let me grab some that are already cut, but I haven't sewn the stems on. The pumpkins themselves are sewn the same size. So this measures right now 6.5 by 9.5 unfinished. When you sew those blocks together, and I press my seams open, or you just cut 6.5 by 9.5. And then depending on where you put the stem, it becomes either the short pumpkin if you put the stem here at the top, or a tall pumpkin if you put the stem that way on the top. So let's just talk about cutting a little bit. So right here, I've written down my cutting. And so again, if you're just doing a plain fabric for a pumpkin, you can just grab, so here's my 7-inch basket. So this is how I cut these really quickly. The reason I cut my strips 7 inches wide, even though 6.5 is kind of a popular size, is because 3.5 plus 3.5 equals 7. So when I'm doing a block that takes 4 matching 3.5-inch squares or something like that, I can go ahead and take this and cut 2 3.5-inch squares. If I had only cut these strips 6.5 inches wide and stuck them in my basket, then I would waste a lot of fabric just by cutting 3.5-inch squares that way. I just like my baskets that are 2.5 inches wide and my 5-inch strips, they work the same way, because 2.5 plus 2.5 equals 5. So same for these two baskets. 3.5 and 7-inch works together. And I really like having the 7-inch strip because it's a larger piece when I do, like I say, have to cut 6.5-inch blocks. So, okay, let me just quickly cut one. So what I do is I just grab a 6.5-inch wide ruler and I just measure down to the 9.5 wide, and then I cut that half strip off the top, and I've got a pumpkin cut. And it's really fast and easy to do it that way because I already have a bunch of oranges in my basket, and I just grab that pile and cut a bunch of pumpkins from it, and it's super fast. Now for the ones that I want to do squares, I just grab my 3.5-inch orange strips, and I just simply, like find the end, or maybe I can do 2 at a time if I want to. Throw my 3.5-inch square ruler here, and look how quick that is. It's just much easier than, you know, grabbing a big piece of fabric and just trying to chop little squares out of it. Now, so that's for the cutting for the pumpkins. So you need 6.5 by 9.5, or if you're going to do then patchwork, then you need 6 squares for both the short pumpkin and the tall pumpkin, and press your seams open. Now for each pumpkin, for the easy corner triangles, like this, that make them round, you'll need 4 2.5-inch squares. And I had those match, and then I also did the top and bottom match, but you don't have to. You can see the borders when I added around these short pumpkins have borders. All 4 of those are different prints, and I really like how that looks in the quilt and how it adds interest. So each pumpkin for the easy corner triangles needs 4 2.5-inch squares. Now for the tall pumpkins, you're going to need to cut your stems 1.5 by 3.5. That's the tall pumpkin stem, 1.5 by 3.5. The short pumpkin stem is 1.5 by 2.5. So that's where I used my 2.5-inch strips. I just grabbed the brown ones out of my 2.5-inch basket and used my 3.5-inch strips for that. Now for the short pumpkin stem sides, meaning the background that goes on the sides, you'll need to cut 2 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles for the sides, meaning each side of the stem. And then for the tall pumpkins, what you'll cut those are, you'll need 2 3-inch by 3.5 inches. And that's what those pieces are right there. So what I did first is I just sewed all of the pumpkins, and I just made a bunch. I don't even know how big I'm going to make this quilt, but I've got quite a few blocks made so far. I just patched the ones I wanted patched, and I'll show you how I do that. And then I just put the easy corner triangles on them, and then I decide which ones are tall and which ones are short, and I go ahead and add the stems. So I'm going to go over to my sewing machine and sew 4 of the blocks up for you so that you can see how I do it. Okay, so here I am at my machine, Miss Lucy, and I've got my Seam So Easy guide in denim on here, taped off with my washi tape, and I'm going to be following this center line right here so that I don't have to mark my easy corner triangles. So I've got 2 backgrounds for my tall pumpkins and 2 backgrounds for my short pumpkins, and I have 2 patchwork, and I have 2 plain pumpkins that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to grab, let's see, so those can be my stems, and let me grab 2 short ones. Those can be my stems for my short pumpkins, so I'll just kind of set those aside. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you how I chain piece all of these together. And so here we go. Okay, so now I've got all of the easy corner triangles on all 4 blocks, and I'm just going to go ahead and trim that excess off, and then I'm going to press towards the triangles. I won't press these seams open. It's not necessary. Now these trimmings are only that big, so there's not really much you can do with those unless you wanted to run these back under here, and you would have a very tiny half square triangle. So you could do that, but I normally don't save them at this point. These are already left over, so I just go ahead and call it good and put them in the wastebasket. If they were larger and I could cut like a 1.5 inch square out of them, I would save these and put them under the ruler and cut a 1.5 inch square, and then add that to my 1.5 inch square baskets. Sometimes I do large enough ones that I can get 2 inch squares or 2.5 inch squares, and that's where a lot of the squares come from that are in my squares basket that I showed you in my blue cabinet on those shelves, not in my closet, that I showed you when I was talking about my scrappy stash during that video. Okay, so I've got all 4 of these, and now what I need to do before I add the stems is to go ahead and sew the stems. So I have 2 pieces for each side of the tall stem, and again the tall stems are cut 1.5 by 3.5. So how I know which side to sew them on, see, I mean obviously that's not going to work, so those 2 match up, so that's what you're going to run through the machine. Okay, so as you noticed in the opening of the film that I had my short pumpkins and my tall pumpkins next to each other, well, obviously I need to add some borders on the short pumpkin so that it ends up being 12 inches tall like this one. This right now measures 6.5 by 12.5 unfinished, the tall pumpkins, and they'll measure 6 by 12 when sewn into the quilt. This one measures 8.5 inches tall right now and 9.5 inches wide. And then it will finish at 8 by 9 when it's sewn into the quilt if you didn't use borders, but we are doing borders. And so what I do with those is it's just scrappy. And so I'll add one to the top first. These are cut 2.5 by 9.5. So I'll just sew those. Let's see, that's the same print. So I think I'll switch places with those. And these are all just scrappy. See, I have my 9.5 inch by 2.5 inch strips here and my 12.5 inch here. So I'm going to sew those onto the top and bottom first, and then I'll go ahead and sew, let's see, two different 2.5 by 12.5 on the sides. So then they'll end up looking like this, and they will be the same height as the tall pumpkin. So this ends up being a block. You can sew these two together and that's one block. But the reason I'm not going to do that now is because depending on the row that you put them in the quilt, you will start with your tall pumpkin being on the left side or the right side. So I'm just going to pan over here to the quilt again and I'll explain that. Okay, so here are the blocks laid out on my design wall. I have not sewn the short pumpkins to the tall pumpkins yet, but I just wanted to show you how you lay them out. So on the top left hand, you see that I started with the short pumpkin, so then the tall pumpkin needs to go that way and alternate. So they need to go into set of twos. So you can see I have short, tall, short, tall, short, tall. So then back over to row 2 over here on the left to the beginning. I start out with a tall. So there's a tall pumpkin, then short, tall, short, tall, short. And so then row 3 down here is just going to be exactly the same as row 1, and then row 2 and 4 are going to be the same, and on down. You can just keep going down. You can keep adding pumpkins onto the side for as wide as you want to make your quilt or as tall as you want to make your quilt. I think this would be awesome as a big quilt on a bed for fall because it's so easy to put together. You simply just have to put the borders around the short pumpkin blocks, and that works as your sashing. And so all you have to do is sew the blocks together. And you just have to remember that you have to have them in even sets of 2. You have to have a short pumpkin and a tall pumpkin together as one block to go in each row so that the math will work out. And I'm pretty excited about this quilt. It was really fun to make. I loved doing all the different backgrounds, borders, scrappy. I thought it added a lot of interest to the quilt, and I loved using all of the different shades of oranges, and I especially loved sewing from my 3.5 inch by 7 inch scrappy baskets and feeling like I got a whole quilt out of just leftovers. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will meet you back here at my sewing machine next week with another Sew From Your Stash series block.